The first voice recording was made in 1860. It was a 10-second fragment of the French folk song Au clair de la lune recorded by inventor Edward Leon Scott de Martinville. But who will make the final voice recording and when? What will it be? Who will hear it?
Yeah, for sure. I'll admit that was partly in mind when we thought of the name was, that kind of leaps out to the eye, I guess, in a way, and it's like partially a joke, but partially pretty serious. Like, we're talking about a lot of serious, I guess, socio-political stuff that makes you feel a little bit like the end days are around the corner, and what's the biggest end day of all but the heat death of the universe, I guess.
He walked out in the gray light and stood, and he saw for a brief moment the absolute truth of the world. The cold, relentless circling of the intestate earth. Darkness implacable. The blind dogs of the sun in their running. The crushing black vacuum of the universe. And somewhere 200 animals trembling like ground foxes in their cover. Borrowed time and borrowed world and borrowed eyes with which to sorrow it.
And lo, for the earth was empty of form, and void, and darkness was all over the face of the deep, and we said, look at that fucker dance.
Okay, welcome to Heat Death of the Universe, entering your brains from beyond linear space-time continuum, yet somehow also from Seoul, South Korea, on this Sunday, May 23rd at 11:07 a.m. Joining us today from another, now also illusory point on the space-time continuum, is Stephen Grumbine, who is, among other things, an activist, an educator, the host of the macroeconomics and politics podcast, Macro and Cheese. I like that name. I heard you describe it the other day as the cheese part being the politics, right?
That's right.
And also, importantly as well, the founder of Real Progressives, which is a network of activists, organizers, and educators that is in part, maybe large part, I would say, dedicated to educating people on modern monetary theory, MMT, from here on out.
Not just monetary theory.
Yes, just the theory of money, which this kind of is actually, but we'll get to that. Which, yeah, fortunately happens to be our subject today. So thanks so much for being here, Steve.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, you're probably used to this, and I'm sure you can give us a great nutshell, a sort of Cliff Notes version of for people who might not know, or people who know just a little bit here and there, like, what exactly do we mean by MMT?
So, MMT is in essence macroeconomics. That's really what it is. But MMT in particular focused largely on the changes that occurred in 1972 when the Nixon administration removed the United States from the Bretton Woods Accord. What it did was it changed us fundamentally from a peg currency to a commodity to a sovereign, free-floating fiat currency. And this is not really particularly modern, and it's not particularly new. Its foundations are in chartalism. And it really kind of speaks to Knapp's, state theory of money, where the state is the currency issuer, and that currency is largely a unit of account. It's a inch or a pound. It's a measurement. And, Warren Mosler, who is oftentimes called the father of modern monetary theory, would say that the dollar is nothing more than a tax credit, and that the United States government issues these tax credits to provision itself. And the imposition of the tax is there to make us need the state currency. And so, a lot of the understandings we all have of money were written pre-1972. A lot of this stuff is founded on the idea that we're backed by gold, or that we sell bonds to actually fund our governments, and that if bond vigilantes lose faith in the government, then all of a sudden, you'll have hyperinflation in the world. We're all going to die, and so forth. And what MMT does is largely makes all the conspiracies and all the bad takes on money rather boring, and it just brings it out like an operations manual. And it explains point blank that the currency issuing government has control over their currency, that central banks are merely an extension of the federal governments of like the UK and Australia and Japan and China and the US, and that a country that issues its own currency can never go broke on debt denominated in its own currency, because it creates said currency at will. So, in essence, we've been taught that money is a scarce thing, when in reality, money is the least scarce thing out there. It's man-made, it's keystrokes, it's pieces of paper, it's coupons like airline miles.
Spreadsheet.
But exactly. And so what is really the scarce thing is the seats on the airplane that your frequent flyer miles get you, or the seats at the concert that your concert ticket gets you. The concert ticket is not my precious. It's the concert that's my precious, right? So what MMT does is really takes away all the mystery and all the, the smoke and mirrors that, economists have for years stayed employed by deploying, and makes it so that regular people can understand the way currency operates. And, it's one of the most important things that we can learn, because you see austerity around the world, austerity in the United States, people doing without because of the fear of us running out of money or the debt. And really, MMT has answers for all of that.
I feel like there was some austerity news that just hit the waves, or the tweets or whatever, just recently, with the Biden administration turning down the student loans and public option.
Let's just say backing off of every single thing he limply promised along the way. Yeah.
Yeah. Biden's been, I would like to say he's been a disappointment, but he's exactly who I thought he'd be. Right. I mean, he's given you 40 years of experience to tell you, not only is he an Austerian, but he's a Republican with a D in front of his name. He's not there's nothing progressive about Joe Biden. He has been a handmaiden for the Wall Street banks. He has been on the take for credit card companies, and he's done everything in his power to make life hell for Jane and Joe Public for the last 40 years. And
definitely.
It's horrible.
Yeah, we could spend 3 hours talking about Biden, and we kind of did, I think, on our last episode. So
I have a bad habit of getting off track.
No, it's cool.
No, just knowing about MMT, and like, even if I'm not 100% sure, like knowing it's there, knowing that like we basically use this system whenever we sign the new Pentagon budget, like every 2 years or whatever. But also being, I have more student loans than I probably should because of just like life circumstances, and honestly, that's not that big of a deal. I'm fine, but like, I've known people that could really use like a public option, and just like, why don't we have those things? And I've got it even more like I've been in South Korea for like 10 years, and I know people from like just all over now. But meeting like some of my good friends are from England and stuff, or like just different parts of Europe, and being like, oh yeah, we don't have student loans, or we have public options. It sounds so nice. It's like, why don't we have this?
Yeah,
well, I think it.
Oh,
go ahead, man.
Yeah, well, yeah. When the kind of the scales fall from your eyes when you get a first glimpse at what MMT is really proposing, or what the reality is it's exposing, and yeah, it really makes you realize like there's truly no good reason we can't have quote nice things, you know. Yeah, it and that's that sense of like liberation I think a lot of people feel when they first at least just discover that this thing MMT exists, whether they're even completely sold on it or not. But yeah, that's all I wanted to add in there.
Well, you know, I want you to think about something, right? So, you know, money is, you know, just a thing, right? It comes from, you know, your bank. You know, most of the money that you have in there is digital. Right. It came via keystrokes.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see that. It's really not hard to see that. I mean, we didn't dig fiat dollars up out of the ground. You know, fiat dollars are spoken into existence. Right. And so when you start wondering, how in the world is it possible that within a blink of an eye, we can give billions of dollars of aid to Israel without even thinking about it? We can give the Pentagon more money under Biden than Trump even, without raising taxes during a pandemic, while people are out of work, tax receipts are down, and suddenly we have even more billions to give to the military industrial complex. And you don't hear a single peep, not one peep. Oh my God, it's going to be inflation. We're going to have hyperinflation now that we spent money in the military. The only time you hear that is the minute that somebody says, hey, what about we the people? What about, you know, giving some health care to somebody during a pandemic? What about getting rid of some predatory student loans? You know, what about any of this stuff? You know, I'm carrying $130,000 of student debt myself. And, you know, I think to myself, wow, that might help me a little bit if they got rid of student debt. You know, that's like a mortgage on my back, you know, on top of a mortgage. And, you know, kids coming out of school, you know, we're subsidizing corporate America with their training, education, and development programs by putting it on kids before they can even get a job. They have to have a master's degree to get an entry-level position. What is that? There's no more entering into the mailroom. There's no democracy in the workplace. People are out there literally subsidizing big industry constantly. And we don't even think twice about it. But the minute you tell somebody, hey, we're going to give them free college, they're moochers. What's going to bring hyperinflation? And so I think that MMT, once you lift the veil, I think you go through several phases, right? You go through this pissed off phase where you're like, what the hell just happened? I just realized that everything in front of me is a lie. Then you start having a moment where you think about all the possibilities of what we can do now that we understand this. And then you start looking around at all the people that are still living with the blinders on and realize, oh my God, we're still doomed. Even though now I know this stuff, we're still doomed. Yeah. People are not learning this stuff. They're not willing to accept it. And it's like, why did you have no problem with $750 billion going to the military? But then the minute I talk about a couple $100 billion to go to provide people health care, you're whining about hyperinflation. I mean, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I think so much of it is what, especially with the military, is like fear and messaging, like just like years of being like, if we don't do this, there will be terrorists, yada, yada. And that, so people's like, oh, military is obviously necessary, but healthcare, well, we've lived without it. We can keep living without it. Maybe life would be better, but you know, it's not necessary for a protection.
I think even though with something as
I don't believe that, by the way. I'm just like,
well, sure, but something as absurd as the insanely bloated, you know, military budget. I think there's this issue, and it's something I wanted to bring up anyway. You wrote about this, Steve, I think maybe back during the last presidential campaign. I forget the date exactly, but just about the way that even someone that, we all, latched onto, Bernie Sanders, even the way he would speak about the national debt and would give good, formulas for how, explaining, yes, how we will pay for Medicare for all. But in a way, I mean, I'm thinking about this as obviously a total fantasy hypothetical, but I just sort of started imagining, like, had he busted out some MMT on some of these journalists when they kept hounding him for how you're going to pay for this, and especially given that, Stephanie Kelton, she's probably like maybe one of the more well-known MMT proponents now, and she was Sanders' chief economic strategist, financial strategist.
Mm-hmm.
So if that had, and I understand why, Sanders didn't go for that kind of messaging if it was even brought up at all. But in a way, you kind of just wonder, like, well, why not? Why not? Like, at the very least, that could have maybe injected MMT into a more mainstream discourse, whether he won or not. And I mean, I think he was going to be railroaded by the Democrats kind of regardless, but
yeah.
I don't know. Well, you wrote a piece about like how like Sanders supporters were kind of like zealous, and I agree with that. I mean, not all of them, but a good chunk of them, and they're afraid to criticize Bernie for anything, including like his keeping MMT at arm's length. So yeah, I was just curious at what you think about that possibility, if it would have made any substantial difference. Like, I mean, not actually even saying like, would he have won the presidency or something like that, but I don't know, would it have at the very least brought this issue, I don't know, into the broader public?
I'm glad you asked that question because, Warren Mosler, years before Stephanie had been, working with him, had tried to get in touch with Bernie Sanders, and Bernie wouldn't even talk to him. Later on, as Stephanie became the Senate Budget Committee economist, the chief economist for the minority, back when Sanders was, the minority, the Democratic lead on the Senate Budget Committee, he didn't want to hear anything from Warren either. But yet there's some really great pictures out there where Stephanie and Bernie, present the sectoral balances, graphic where you see, net spending, you see the private debt, public debt, and rest of world. And it's one of the most important things that you'll ever find that MMTers point to in terms of understanding the economy. And so I give Bernie lots of credit for number one, bringing Stephanie into the fold. I give him a lot of credit for allowing her to go to Sanders Institute. I give him a lot of credit for bringing her along for his first presidential run and her second presidential run, because as he advanced her platform and her standing in the community, so to speak, even though he didn't do it, he gave her a lot of exposure and a lot of opportunities, and she took advantage of most of them. One of the toughest things, though, with Sanders in general, though, is that he's been talking for 50 years the same exact way. If you play one of his speeches from 1980, it sounds an awful lot like one of his speeches in 2021.
Yeah.
And, he's never left message. He's been saying the same things, and it's still valid. And the only problem is, go ahead.
I was going to say that's one of the things that I generally like about him, but I can also see how it can be a problem. Anyway.
Well, it blocked his ability to pivot and change course, right?
Yeah.
And so Warren Mosler wrote this thing in Huffington Post, basically, that was like, if I was talking to Bernie Sanders, here's what I would say. And he gave like a speech of what Bernie should say. And he basically laid it out kind of similar to what I said at the beginning, that, hey, you know, the federal government can do whatever it needs to do to provision itself. It can never go broke. And, you know, unfortunately, Bernie wasn't perfect. He didn't do everything we wanted him to do. And he is recalcitrant when it came to MMT. And he was, you know, his brother, ironically, Larry Sanders, very much in support of MMT. Ironically, Jane Sanders, very, very in support of MMT. But, you know, Bernie is, you know, a little bit of a stubborn dude, and, you know, give him credit for staying on point. But this was a weakness. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, I was a huge Bernie supporter, and I still have a lot of fond memories of Bernie. But a lot of his, you know, most ardent supporters, similar to Marxists, who I consider myself a kindred spirit with, they have a religious zeal to protecting their Messiah. And Bernie was their Messiah, as many Marxists see Marx as a Messiah. And so when you critique various aspects of their game, you know, they come out in droves just to shoot you down and knock you down like you somehow or another, you know, committed sacrilege. And, you know, that really hurt our movement, quite frankly. It devastated our movement. This pandemic, you would have thought, would have taken us to new heights, because clearly, you know, people weren't working. Right. And if they're not working, you can't have tax revenues. And if you don't have tax revenues, how's everything happening? And so it should have brought some things to the forefront, which for some of us, it was vindication. For others, they stayed, you know, head under the sand and never quite bought onto it. But it's pretty obvious, even without being a math major or a PhD or anything else, that, you know, when the government wants to spend money, it has it. And when it doesn't want to spend money, it doesn't have it. And, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist either. I mean, if you read Howard Zinn's History of the United States and other history of the world projects that are tied to Howard Zinn, you realize that capital has always played this game. I mean, it has influenced us from the birth of this nation in terms of our colonization of the United States. And quite frankly, the U.S.'s number one export is neoliberalism. And all the countries around the world that have had great public sector services, that have been quasi-socialist, socialist type things, they have literally watched their social service safety net diminish as the U.S. exported capitalism to them and told them, hey, it's great to have for-profit healthcare. Trust me, you'll love it. And so you watch the attacks on the NHS, and you watch the attacks down in Australia. And, you know, it's a shame. But Bernie, to his credit, tried his best, failed, but tried his best. And now it's up to us. And so, you know, I stopped crying over Bernie. I did cry. Trust me, I cried hard. Because he was the closest thing we had in my lifetime to somebody who got it. And it's a shame. It's a shame. I'm not gonna lie, it's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, it was surreal to see him run the first time around, because I'd been a big fan of his, and I had said things like jokingly like Sanders for president, you know, in the years prior. And then he actually was doing it. And then not only that, you know, these stadiums start filling up, and it was like thrilling, and it was very exciting. And then also equally like soul crushing to see the whole thing fall apart. But, I was just going to say to like that idea of the sort of people with a lot of zealotry attacking anyone who dares, you know, criticize, you know, the Messiah. I always tend to find that funny. Like, this is obviously just anecdotal Twitter stuff, but like, I have to tell people that are like, you know, 15 years or so, whatever, younger than me, who just found out what socialism is 3 days ago. Like, you know, I've been supporting Bernie Sanders since like the year 2000. So I don't really need a lecture on like being a fan of the guy. But anyway, I want to kind of circle back because you were talking about the sort of like the stages of discovering MMT, and I know that you have like a pretty interesting sort of personal development politically. Yeah. And I don't know if this is a fair characterization, but like your sort of discovery of MMT might be your like road to Damascus moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say a little bit about your sort of political history, and because I think not a lot of people have something where they really shift like to a polar opposite point politically. So it's something interesting. If you wouldn't mind sharing about that.
Yeah, MMT played a huge role in a lot of pivot points in my life, and it continues to provide pivot points in my life. But, I was born into a home that revered Ronald Reagan. I was a staunch Christian conservative Republican for a long, long time. And, I think in 2002, I was arrested for marijuana. I had a good job. I was a senior sales engineer at Verizon.
Okay.
I was making really good money. And I went out and bought 2 ounces of pot, cut in quarters. And, I was drunk as a skunk, and I'm in recovery, by the way, now. But at the time I wasn't. And I got arrested that night. I walked into a 7-Eleven, and it was like 2 a.m, and I was blitzed, and went up to the cash register to buy a carton of Camel Lights, and looked over and saw a cop stirring his coffee. And I said to the cashier, I was like, "Do you think he knows that I'm drunk?" And he goes, if he didn't before, I'm pretty sure he does now. And so I was like, snap. So it was December 14th and 2002. And not to put too fine a point on it. And the cop came up and gave me a back rub and said, "Hey, how about you do this? It's Christmas time. I feel in the mood to cut you a break. Why don't you go out there and make a phone call, and we'll pretend like this didn't happen." I said, "Oh, thank you, officer." And so I go out to the phone booth and start to make a call. And I'm like, "What am I doing here? I forgot what I'm doing. What am I supposed to be doing here at the phone?" And I fell asleep with my head against the phone. Then I woke up and got in my car and drove off right in front of him. Woo!
Oh, no.
And so my life changed right there. And what really happened, this is the beginning, right? This is the very beginning of my conversion. I was in a jail cell with a bunch of young Black kids. And, here I am with 2 ounces of marijuana and paraphernalia and, whatever. And these kids were in there with a joint, one joint.
Yeah.
And they were going to be held for 2 weeks until their trial date. And they were releasing me that night because I'm a man of the people. I am a well educated, and I've got a good job, and, I go to church and whatever. And so they were going to let me go. And they did. They let me walk out. Granted, I had huge, I was facing horrible charges. I was facing 26 years based on that night.
Is like probably enough for like resale charges or whatever.
That's exactly it. And so I ended up going to court, and I ended up plea bargaining to PBJ. I copped to simple possession charge and went to rehab for several months. And work release, was able to keep my job. A lot of people would never have that happen. They would lose their job immediately. They'd lose their home. Their family couldn't help them. None of those things were mine. I had a lot of privilege, a lot of opportunity that I didn't even know was possible. And so, but I came out of there, and I never shook the idea of talking to those young kids in that jail cell. And it just stuck with me. Now, mind you, I am very much a conservative Republican at that moment. There's nothing. But I'm sitting there having this moment where I'm realizing something is changing. Well, a few years later, I've been with Verizon for a long time, Bell Atlantic, CMP, then, so forth. And when the global financial crisis hit, they laid 10,000 of us off. Now, I had just gotten my second master's degree, and, I was feeling pretty confident. And so I put myself on a RIF list. I said, hey, go ahead and lay me off. Don't lay these other people off. Lay me off. I've got the education. I should be able to find a job without any problem at all. I was a top of my craft. I had every Cisco certification under the sun. I was a networking, subject matter expert. I could do it all. And lo and behold, it just so happened to be right in the middle of the global financial crisis, which turns out to be built on elite control fraud and all kinds of stuff. But as I left my job, it took 18 months to find work. And during this time period, I had people working on me, teaching me about MMT and teaching me about, the plight of regular people that hadn't had the kind of privilege I had. And little by little, the MMT message started clicking. And that was when I realized, holy shit, taxes don't fund spending. So I've been sitting there belly aching about taxes. Republicans have it wrong. They want to cut taxes because they don't think we need these things. And Democrats have it wrong because they want to raise taxes because they think we need to raise them to pay for things. And so I'm like, well, God, where do I stand? Both of these guys are full of shit. And I didn't know what to do. And so this caused me to ask more questions and more questions. And I have an insatiable need to learn. I have an insatiable desire to learn. And so MMT people were like, hey, this guy is hungry. Let's keep feeding him. And so I fought, I kicked around. It was hard for me to process. I had an MBA. I'd learned all the classical stuff. Listening to this was really challenging. I was a Ron Paul guy. So I was a gold bug and I had all kinds of Austrian minded thinking. Sure. And so it was even harder for me to escape this thinking. But MMT showed me, how economics worked. And so I had to disassemble all these mental connections of the Ron Paul world and all the libertarian thinking that went into it. And it really took years, but that was the come to Jesus moment, so to speak, was right then and right there. And it's been a journey that I took so seriously. I started 2 nonprofits to get the word out, and the podcast Macro and Cheese and a host of other things. So it's obviously had a major impact on my life. And, it's not that I want to be a lefty. It's just that it makes sense to be a lefty. After you learn how it works, once you realize that it is a political choice to leave people destitute, you become very committed to changing that. I have anyway.
No, because there's. I was going to say I'm kind of similar in that when I was younger, like a teenager, I was I hate to say it on the podcast, but I really liked Ayn Rand at one point in my life.
You've said this a few times on the podcast, by the way.
But because of like family problems, I was never really like in trouble, but my sister had or has had lots of substance abuse problems, and when I was in my young 20s, it spiraled out of control to where like it not just like basically just like ruined her, but it ruined a lot of my immediate family. And just seeing how the system can just grind you down, and there's like no escaping it once it starts grinding you down. And I guess it also just makes you start thinking about like the natural lottery and how like the system's really rigged. If you're not like just born into like a fairly affluent like life, the system's not rigged to like help you out. And they're seeing something just morally bankrupt about the whole thing.
Oh yeah,
it has to be something better.
Yeah, but this is not new, right? Yeah. I mean, nothing new under the sun. I mean, you go back to feudalism, and you go back to the French Revolution, and you go back to the American Revolution. I mean, people still think the American Revolution was like some grassroots revolution. It was a bunch of bougie, rich dudes that came from the old world that didn't want to pay their stuff back to England. They wanted freedom. They wanted to be the rock stars out here in the new world. And it wasn't some sort of a, lower class up and, it was a true, honest to goodness, top down type of thing. And, this has been going on, right? And it keeps changing. I mean, you see the machinations for slavery and class and race and, there's so many aspects that you can look at through history as you watch, not only the slave trade, but then you watch Reconstruction, and you watch the little blip of time where you had a moment where we could have really done some things correctly, and we still doubled down on racism and destroying any sense of progress we could have had from all the death and destruction of the Civil War. And it just kept carrying forward, and it just morphs. It just transitions slightly differently. And we're always in the same place, only a little bit worse. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as the contradictions of society and the contradictions of end stage capitalism, clash with one another. And, they'll give you a minute where they make you feel like, oh, everything's okay. They do give you a couple crumbs and make you feel like, oh, wow, see, things are changing. It's better now. God, it's so much better now.
They send you a $1,400 check.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Keep the change, dude. Right. It's been a real kick in the pants, so to speak, because, I had envisioned, a Bernie Sanders presidency and a lot of executive orders writing off student debt and making marijuana legal and all these great things, that a person with a conscience would do. And lo and behold, we got a guy who is a shell of a man in Biden. And people are celebrating because, my God, Trump was just such a freaking buffoon that he'd make a jar of acid seem like it's a rock star. He's just it's a shame too.
I was in shock the day, like many other Americans, I was in shock the day that Donald Trump was elected, but also I was just profoundly sad the day Biden was elected, just because I was like, we were so close.
Yeah, man. I tell you what, I think of it like this, right? I allowed myself to believe, quite frankly, when Ron Paul, back before Bernie, the election prior, when Ron Paul won Iowa, when he went through and they started doing all the stuff with all the caucuses, they had a really smooth game plan, a really great grassroots effort. Whether you like Ron Paul's politics or not, it doesn't matter, because that wasn't the point. It was like I believed for a minute. I allowed myself to become a part of the Paul Bot movement, man. I was a true Paul Bot for a while, right? And I got really disgusted. And then all of a sudden Bernie came around, and I was much further along on my journey. And the reason, ironically, why I supported Bernie was because Kelton was his economic advisor. And I said, here's a chance for MMT to get to the top. I didn't really care about Bernie yet. I wasn't a Bernie guy. I was a Kelton guy. And so I came into the Bernie movement sideways, right? I know who in the hell it follows a politician because of their economic advisor, right? Well, I do, right? And so,
it's an interesting way in. No, exactly. No, so, you could respond to being called a Bernie bro with a Kelton bro. Come on.
Exactly, man. I'm an MMT. Well, the funny thing is that for years I was called a cult leader. And they made videos about me, wrote evil articles about me. They chased me around on social media.
Just from putting out the word on MMT?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so think about this, right? If you've never heard of MMT before.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you see some dude I'm very open about my past, because my journey is part of the hope I give people that Republicans can be changed, right? I hope that people see that as a green light to try to extend olive branches where you normally would not. And, as part of this, it became quite clear to me that I had to come up with a bumper sticker kind of slogan, because people give you 15 seconds if you're lucky. Mm-hmm. And so I started voicing this whole thing about taxes don't fund spending. Well, there was this one lady, Lily Starling, who, God love her, she was just a nasty little part of the Mean Kids Club. And she started telling everybody, he's a former libertarian and he's a right winger and he's just talking about taxes don't fund spending because he doesn't like taxes. And that's the typical right wing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, bonehead, just think about this for a minute. if the Republicans are standing in the way of healthcare, if the Republicans are standing in the way of student debt relief, the Republicans are they're standing in the way because of taxation. They don't want to pay taxes for your bad choices. That's their whole thing. So if you can eliminate their argument, you have a shot at getting some common sense cloth coat Republicans to come with you, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea here was always to present things in a way that would provide you with, remember, the 99% doesn't care if it's Republican or Democrat. The 99% is really the working class. And so if you stop allowing all the neoliberal stratification and all the balkanization of different groups through identity politics and so forth, if you take a class-based approach with an understanding of intersectionality, because it's required, it really is required. But if you take that class-based approach, you realize that you're going to have to deal with some people that you may not politically agree with. And that became very clear in the MMT messaging, because MMT is not political in any way, shape, or form. It's like reading a plumbing manual, and as political as a plumbing manual can get, that's MMT, right?
It's like an analytical tool rather than like it's kind of morally, politically neutral, right?
It's a lens. It tells you if I put too much water in the sink, it'll overflow on the ground. And if I don't put enough in there, then it'll dry up and all that toothpaste will get stuck to the side of the thing. I mean, it's just that simple. It doesn't tell you, it's not making a value judgment, right?
Right.
However, I would suggest that once you know MMT, if you understand that poverty is a political decision, which is quite clear based on the understanding that we have the money. It's not that we have the money, we create the money. The government neither has or doesn't have dollars. It creates them at will, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you understand that, and you still allow all the homelessness in San Francisco to occur, and you still allow Flint to go without drinking water, and you still allow Puerto Rico to be gutted after a freaking hurricane by venture capitalists and vultures, and instead of just making them right. When you do that, you're an asshole. That's what MMT shows you. You're an asshole because you know that you could fix it, but you choose not to. And so it really does separate the wheat from the chaff. And I think that in and of itself is why a lot of people reject MMT, because they realize, oh crap, I'm an asshole. And that's tough. And I looked that devil in the eye, and I am an asshole, right? I know I was, and I know I can be still. And that whole awakening, so to speak, really, really, really cascaded down. I mean, if you're a process person, right, and you start thinking about all the connecting inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques throughout your life, and every thought that you have, every belief you have, and you start watching how these things connect out, and you realize you've got to disassemble all those synapses and you've got to rewire those things. That's a tall order. And people, they're not interested in rewiring their entire existence half the time. And MMT truly does make it so that you have no choice but to rewire it, because you've been lied to. We've been propagandized. We've been lied to, because what do rich people want? How do they measure themselves, right? They measure themselves as the distance between them and the next guy below them.
Sure.
And so it's the gap, the whole gap, and nothing but the gap, so help me God, that they measure themselves by. So when we want more, you think about slavery ending, well, they just transferred it to us. They just spread it out. And so now, instead of chattel slavery, we have a different form of slavery, and we're wage slaves.
And prison labor slaves.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much slavery going on right now. And MMT, through the job guarantee, which is a core principle of MMT, shows us that we can do better than that. We can alter that equation. And it provides a lens to assess all that stuff. So, I think that, one of the biggest things that MMT does is it really provides a mirror for everyone to look at themselves and say, what are my values? What do I value?
I think that's a great way to think about it. And I see it also as just, it sweeps away so much unnecessary like layers of bullshit that get in the way of getting to that point. Because I keep thinking about like, I don't know if I added up like all the hours of noise I've had to hear in my lifetime of Democrats and Republicans, the tax and spend liberals and the small government Republicans, every talking head, like news bullshit, I mean, I guess like even before cable news where it was just two people yelling at each other, I think you guys know what I mean. So that was like, that dominated like so much political discussion for so long. And that's what was seen as like, your hands steepled together, serious politics is like, well, I'm fiscally conservative, but socially liberal and all this, just all of that horse shit goes away the second you accept the very basic premise of MMT, because what were they arguing over if not just, surpluses and deficits and stuff it's all basically in a way fictional and just moved around depending on which, blue or red color is heading up the office at the moment. So
absolutely. I want you to think about something funny. So Stephanie Kelton put out a tweet probably a year ago, and it's one of my favorite tweets she's ever put out. It had two pictures. One looked like a Gordian knot with spaghetti all over the place, and the other one was a straight line A to B. And she goes, everyone else, MMT. And it's exactly the case. I mean, if you ask them to give you a simple answer, they can't. MMT is just so cut to the bone, right straight to the point, and it just wipes out any of the nonsense. And people, I got to tell you, I get bored really quickly listening to political commentators that don't understand MMT. I have zero interest in alternative media that doesn't understand MMT. When I see my friends and stuff in this movement that don't know MMT and they're waxing poetic about economics, my eyes roll back in my head so far I can see my brain. It's one of those really, really, I have no tolerance for it anymore because time's ticking. I mean, it was like 4 years ago, we said 11 years with the IPCC. We're down to 7 years now. And I think that's generous. And, we don't have time. And, the only way for us to really, really attack some of the real serious problems that we have, think about this, as climate change moves in, if you accept climate change, that is, but just assume that it's correct, right? Well, I'm just saying, like, for those people out there, I mean, it's a great name for the podcast, right? But as you think about the idea of climate change and you think about mitigating any of the stuff, let's just say hypothetically, we have to break out, nuclear reactors to try to back away from the carbon in the atmosphere. Let's just say hypothetically, we have to do something radical, really radical. I mean, that requires massive infusion of cash, like deep water filtration to bring water into, coastal areas like California and stuff, so they have potable drinking water. I mean, on and on and on. There's so many things that require huge investments that there's no way the private sector will ever step up to do that. And it really isn't in their best interest to do it because they need to make profit. Well, our survival is not a profit thing. It's a matter of, do we exist or not? It's an existential thing. And so as we're hemming and hawing about whether or not this is going to raise inflation or, whether this is going to bring on the next Weimar Republic and all the other crazy nonsense that people, chicken littles that don't know anything about econ say, it really, really sidelines an entire movement. And, time is ticking, man, and physics doesn't negotiate, right? So if we don't understand how we can afford to do great things, then we're going to be we're not even going to be a puff of smoke. We're going to vanish. But you think about places like Pakistan and India, and as you start having climate refugees where you've got two naturally warring groups, and now all of a sudden they're having to migrate into, Muslims migrating into, Hindi type territories, and, the wars that will occur and resource wars and water wars. And it's a very, very real thing. So understanding these things, MMT provides a way out. It provides a path forward. And And I think those are the sorts of things that really add to the urgency of spreading this message around.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say on the subject of the federal jobs program, like being it's kind of the backbone of most MMTers, like vision for how this whole thing works. So like, I guess to get a little bit into some of the criticisms, I guess like you could distill a lot of the criticisms down to one word, which is inflation or hyperinflation. And so my understanding of MMT is that like you can get to a point where, yes, dangerous levels of inflation occur under, utilizing MMT, but it's easily mitigated by this jobs guaranteed program, right? And it's I also kind of want to talk about the role of taxes, though,
Sure.
in reducing inflation. That's the way I seem to understand it.
So let's take a look at inflation, right? There's stocks and there's flows. And stocks and flows are very, very core economic terms to really understand. Holding cash is a stock. Spending cash is a flow. And so the growth of money in no way, shape, or form causes inflation. If I print, God, I hate the word printing money, but if I print $1 trillion, and
we know you mean keystrokes.
Exactly. But if I put $999 billion into the hands of one rich dude, and then I give the 1 billion to the rest of the people, there's still $1 trillion that was just printed. And you're not going to see inflation because the one dude, he's not going to be able to buy enough loaves of bread. He's not going to buy enough electric. You know what I'm saying? Like it's about real resources. It's not about cash. And so if I give everybody $10,000 suddenly, and you're like, oh my God, I can finally get my teeth filled, or I can finally, get that tire changed on my car, or I can finally, get the hole in my bathroom patched up, or, fix the plumbing or whatever. Suddenly people are spending money. Now what you've got is a question of, did the real resources exist that people wanted and needed? And let me give you a very, very anecdotal, fun kind of example of this. The PlayStation 5 and the Xbox, the new Xbox that came out, they had an initial release, and then the pandemic hit. And the semiconductor shortage created a delay in getting new product out the door. Yeah. But there was a heavy demand for these things. Everybody wanted one, right? And so you saw people buy a bunch of them early on. And if you go out there on places like Mercari and Wish or Amazon or eBay, you'll see people selling what was originally a $500 item for $1,200 and $1,400 for what really, once the semiconductor shortage is done, will come back down to $500.
Yeah.
Right. And so you think about what causes inflation. It's not printing money, but it's giving, it's distribution. It's about the real resources. I mean, Paul Ryan was on the, House floor talking with Greenspan of all people.
Right.
And he was trying to use his Ayn Rand logic to talk about, wouldn't it be better to have Social Security privatized and handled by Wall Street than, handled by the government? Wouldn't it make it more solvent, was what he said. And Greenspan goes, solvency isn't really an issue here, guy, which is shocking because he's king neoliberal. He's been one of the worst actors in this thing in the world. But he took Paul Ryan down like Hulk Hogan messing with like some kid in the parking lot. And he told him, he's like, the question is, we can pay anything we want to pay. The question is, do we have the real resources available for purchase that people will want to spend money on? And, and that was one of those big aha moments as you watched Paul Ryan get that soft chin of somebody that just got pistol whipped, and one of the glorious moments, right? But inflation is a big boogeyman because of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman back, in 60s and 70s, this was all part of a libertarian attack on the New Deal. And what they did was they made everyone terribly afraid of the government spending money, printing money, because money growth causes inflation. So, Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money says. And he and Volcker, worked hand in glove during the 70s to make everyone fearful of it. But reality is that we know that's not the case. What is really the case is, do we have the real resources? And you look at what happened during the 70s, OPEC played games with the gas availability.
Sure.
And so you had a nice shortage in gas because they purposely played with it, right? They held it back. And so what happened? The price went up. You had lines. I mean, I was old enough to remember that they would have odd even days where your mom or your dad would be driving up, and if you had an odd license plate, you could get gas that day. And if you had an even license plate, and the lines would be like 50 cars long. It was crazy.
Right.
And that fear of that time really, really stuck. But then guess what happened? Ronald Reagan came in. And what Ronald Reagan did was he said, I can spend on the military through the Cold War in Russia, and I can get the economy back. So he took the Jimmy Carter recession, and he had a Ronald Reagan recession too, that started in 80. And he ended up saying, let's fix this by deficit spending out the wazoo on the military. And, lo and behold, the economy boomed. And for those people that were privileged enough to receive that money, a lot of people did very well. A lot of people didn't, though, right?
And they attributed it to probably, reducing
the free market,
reducing taxes, the free market. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, but there's something to be said for having tax policy at the right size, not just political economy that, well, we need to raise taxes because, there's income inequality we got to defend. And I don't want to get away from inflation yet, because I think it's still important that we got to talk about this. But, ultimately, there's a lot of good reasons for taxation. But these ideas of fair share and all this stuff, that's just feel good stuff that doesn't have any economic value.
Mm-hmm.
So there's good tax and there's bad taxes. And we can talk about that more in a little bit. But ultimately, when you look at inflation, what I believe you will hear most MMTers say is that until you hit full employment, the deficit is too damn low. And you're not going to have real inflation. Inflation is the rise in all prices, not just in one price or another. It's in all prices. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about this, when the gas shortage in, the 70s happened, how many things use petrol products to be made? Plastics, you name it. Exactly. Yeah. Lubricants, you name it. So gasoline is one of those very interesting, petroleum products is one of those very interesting substances that is used in just about everything we do. And so when you think about that, naturally, if the price of gas goes up, the general price of everything will go up. Now, what's interesting, I think, also, is that when you understand that a currency issuing government can absorb the shocks of any kind of price increases like that they can commandeer production. The United States could have easily ramped up its own production and offset any OPEC gains. We have vast oil reserves, but there was a political game going on. So this was one of those things where politics, once again, was trying to create a scenario. And they were very effective at scaring the shit out of everybody. And that scare, just like the Red Scare of socialism, has stuck with us like a wet egg fart in on an elevator. And there's just no getting around it. And so, I think one of the big things that MMT points out is that, number one, that inflation is usually is caused by shortages, supply shocks, and it's also caused by greed and corruption. And it's also caused by interest rate hikes. So, the cost of goods sold by interest rate hikes. And so I think that if you look at inflation has absolutely nothing to do with printing money. And that was one of those big wake up moments for me, because obviously Ron Paul runs around telling everybody we have hyperinflation if you print the money and blah blah blah.
I mean,
and that's where I came from.
People just take that as gospel, like and not even just on the right. I mean, you'll hear that.
Yeah, I've heard it from people
throughout the whole political spectrum for sure.
Yes.
And it's not even gospel. It's taken as just like, it's like 1 + 1. It's like printing money equals inflation.
Yep. It's like Pavlovian. Yes, inflation. I mean, they're not even thinking. They don't even consider what you're saying.
But in the current world, I mean, sure, it's hard to get your PlayStation 5 or your 3080 graphics card, if you want one of those. But we have so much, like there's so much being produced in the world. Like even if everyone just started getting like, a $600 a week job that was provided through the jobs guarantee. I don't know if that would even fill the gap of like what is called aggregate demand, right?
Yes.
Where to where people would be buying enough to actually even start causing inflation.
Well, just think about this, right? If I don't think inflation's a real concern. I think it's a boogeyman still.
Yeah.
And, when we talk about the job guarantee, we're talking about a living wage and we're talking about benefits. So the job guarantee proposes to provide a counterbalance with a public option for employment that the private sector has to meet or beat to hire you out of.
Yeah.
So now rising wages, which have been suppressed now for over 40 years, that will bring about some inflationary pressures, which is not a bad thing. Inflation in and of itself is not a bad thing. Hyperinflation is currency rejection, and hyperinflation is the accelerating rise of prices, all prices, and to the point where you see the old pictures of people running around with wheelbarrows of Reichsmarks, German Reichsmarks, and Zimbabwe $1 trillion and all this stuff. And each one of these things has a very important story to tell, right?
That wheelbarrow picture is like seared into my mind since high school.
It's crazy, right? So, but you think about this, right? Let's evaluate each of these hyperinflation stories for your listeners. So when you look at Weimar Germany, let's start there. Weimar Germany was decimated by the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was cruel, similar to a lot of the treatment that occurred during Reconstruction originally. There was a lot of, cruelty there. Most of it deserved, right? But the reality is that once you put people into a desperate situation, they do desperate things.
Sure.
And Germany had debt denominated in French francs. Well, Germany is not the currency issuer for French francs. So they had to do something to get French francs. And, with the embargoes and all the rules and restrictions on Germany, they were already in a very, very dire position in terms of production. Well, then you had the industrial sector in Germany go on strike to rebel against the conditions, which brought production to its knees. And so if you only had one loaf of bread at the store, 50 people trying to get that one loaf of bread, imagine how quickly the price of that one loaf of bread is going to go through the moon. So ultimately, Germany, Weimar, had absolutely nothing to do with printing money. Nothing, not one bit of it had anything to do with printing money. The printing of money happened well after the hyperinflation.
And it was as a desperate move to get out of a desperate situation. Yeah,
absolutely. You go down there to Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe is an interesting case study as well. Mugabe had taken away all the farmland from the colonizers, and he had given it to his warlords and the people of Zimbabwe. Well, as the colonizers were rolling out, they set fire to the crops, and production was brought down to 40%. And I'm just spitballing, there might have been less than that. And so a country went from food sovereign to food unsovereign and had to import food. Well, they had nothing. They had no productive capacity. They were left in a very, very bad place. And so another supply shock to a major important thing, they had no food. And so what happens? The wheelbarrows come out. There's no amount of money that you can do to provide you with that one loaf of bread that was left, if you know what I'm saying. I'm using that as a metaphor here.
Sure.
But that's the essence of it, right? Had nothing to do with printing money. They didn't just say, let's print money and give everybody socialism, and we're going to go ahead and have a hyperinflation.
Now, if they could print loaves of bread, that would be a whole nother thing.
Hey, we should get to that too, by the way, because I have a thing on basic needs versus basic income that I think we should talk about. I was
going to bring up the contrasting of the guaranteed federal guaranteed jobs program.
So in the United States, we have a federal government. So yes, it would be a federal job guarantee. But in the rest of the world, they have different, government structures.
So if it was like the euro, it would have to be.
Sure. I guess I just mean the guarantee of jobs to those who want them. And contrasting that with UBI, which one of our favorite figures, Andrew Yang, he's brought that into the spotlight in America these days.
In university, university was about 10 years ago. But I was into UBI, and I have distanced myself more and more as I've gotten older. But
it sounds nice at first if you don't dig into it too much. But yeah,
almost everything sounds nice at first until you dig into it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the toughest things, because the people that want a UBI are usually pretty good people. They're desperate. They think they're solving poverty. They don't know any better, right? They don't realize that you can't eat cash. You can eat food. And this goes back to the bread, that loaf of bread.
Mm-hmm.
And, if I give you $1,000, the libertarians, the Ayn Randians, the Milton Friedmans, they've always wanted, the Koch brothers, ironically, love a UBI. Silicon Valley billionaires love a UBI. All these folks love a UBI. Why? Because the only thing wrong with capitalism to them is we need more capitalism. Right.
Yeah.
But they're not providing any transitory, type of scenario. They're not providing you with anything that is other than status quo. What they're doing is they're giving you cash. Well, the underhanded thing is that they're also looking to remove the last vestiges of the New Deal. They're looking to remove the social safety net and say, look, we gave you your $1,000. Now shut up and go make something of yourself.
Yeah, use that for healthcare.
Use that for healthcare and housing and cars and transportation and food. And it's like, after a while, you realize the promise of the UBI is a lie. And more importantly, the purveyors of it, the real chieftains that really bring this stuff to the fore, I believe, are liars and charlatans and snake oil salesmen like Scott Santons. I think they're just bad people. I don't even think that there's something that they don't get. I think they're just straight up bad people.
Yeah, just con artistry.
Absolutely. And when you think about this, right, we already have, in the United States anyway, we already have Social Security, which is a basic income. Okay. And it's used for survivor benefits. It's used for disability. It's used for retirement. It's used for a host of things, right? So if you want to expand a basic income scheme, not a universal basic income, but a basic income scheme, there you go. Social Security is already in existence. If you want to kind of change the rules by which who can get Social Security, who can't, it's already there. What we don't have is an answer for unwanted unemployment, which the Federal Reserve, which has a mandate for full employment in the United States, uses unemployment as a means of staving off inflation. It's a very cruel and useless way of doing it. I mean, they take the Phillips curve, which AOC busted Powell out about, and Powell had to acknowledge, there's really not a lot of proof that this Nauru thing, this Phillips curve, actually works. It's kind of an outmoded idea that's been debunked, but they still use it. And so a job guarantee, by its very nature, not only does it provides you with a job. So now you aren't an unemployed person seeking employment, which we know that if you're unemployed and you try and get a good job, they look at you and they say, well, whatever. But if you're working at a nonprofit, let's say, and it's being paid for through the job guarantee, but you're working at the American Red Cross, or you're working at Real Progressives or whatever, and suddenly you're getting a living wage for working in a nonprofit job that you would have previously done volunteer work, or whatever. Now all of a sudden you do have a job, and you can negotiate, and you could pick up and move anywhere in the country and get a job. You have a job guaranteed to you, and that is mobility, which we haven't had in a generation. That is an absolute the death knell for generational poverty, because now people of all walks of life suddenly have, on command, even if they have a prison record, they have a job, a guaranteed right to a job. And all you have to do is read, some of the books out there talk about, especially like Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And you realize that they use employment as a way of making people that are on probation literally go back to jail. I mean, this is how they discipline them. And you can go back to Reconstruction with vagrancy laws. This has not changed. So a job guarantee does so many things that you don't even think about. And the other thing is this: if I give you a UBI and Walmart wants to hire you at a slave wage, they can subsidize that shit wage with a UBI. But if you're working the job guarantee with a living wage, not only are you trading 40 hours of your life or whatever it is that you're working, that they can't overlap. They can't steal that time from you now.
Yeah.
So in order for them to hire you, they have to meet or beat that wage. There's something truly transformative there, because it's like a national union of workers.
Yeah.
Right? Suddenly you've made a public space for labor once again. And it's a real big deal.
I think I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it up. But what about the small businesses that can't afford to pay that type of wage?
We have a saying that if you can't afford to pay your workers, your chances are your business model is probably not something that should be in business. But let me just say this, and this is a roundabout way when you think about flows, again, going back to flows. If everybody has just suddenly now gotten this raise, okay, because now the job guarantee has given real money to real people to pay their bills, to eat, to pay their electric bill, to pay their mortgage, to live, right? Now, all of a sudden, they're spending money because they have pent up demand, and they have things they need. They need to get their teeth fixed. Well, they need to get food. They need to do whatever. So they're spending that money in these small businesses again.
Yeah.
And so the small business owner has an infusion of cash. And if he doesn't, well, shame on him, because that means that people didn't want to buy his product. Right.
That's what I thought the answer was, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, it's pretty basic. I mean, it's common sense. I have no sympathy. I mean, I have sympathy for their ignorance, but I have no sympathy for the outcome. A job guarantee answers something else too that's very important. The imposition of the tax, the money story, which Warren Mosler uses to great precision. He talks about back in the day, King would want to, build a aqueduct, or he'd want to build a road or something like that. And, he would go to his subject and say, hey, will you come help me build this aqueduct or a road? And the guy'd look at him and say, yeah, I'm eating my potatoes and I'm going fishing, and I think I'll pass on building the road for you. And he's like, yeah, I can understand that. How about if I give you this gold coin? And the peasant's like, what am I going to do with the gold coin? It's not going to do anything for me. Nah, I'll pass. He goes, yeah, you got a good point there. He goes, what if I put a 10 gold coin tax on your house, your hut, and you can only pay it with these things that have my face on it? Now will you? Oh, well, how do I get those coins? I want to keep my house. Funny you should say that. I have this road that I need built, and I have this aqueduct I need built. So this is the way. It's coercive, but this is the way the state has always provisioned itself. Okay. And that's going back to the day of kings, and it's right up to present. Now, we don't live in a monarchy. We do live in an oligarchy, here, but we don't live in a monarchy. And so it's really public money. It's public purpose money. And, we've been led to believe that it's, taxpayer money. And this taxpayer myth has really, really been debilitating, because what do you think a taxpayer looks like? Do you think it's a young gay black guy? Do you think it's a Hispanic person that came up from Costa Rica? Or do you think it's some white dude with a beer belly and like a vest with a stogie hanging out of his mouth? It's those guys, right? And so, the taxpayer myth has always been used to discipline people. Well, if you're a good person and you're a taxpayer, you should have, it's all these should have stuff, right? But it's been used as a cudgel against black and brown people. It's been used as a cudgel against the poor. It's been used as a you're a ne'er-do-good. But think about it. Everybody pays taxes. Every time you buy a piece of food, you pay a tax. Every time you go and, buy gas, you pay a tax. You pay taxes all the time. Mm-hmm. And many of those people, even if they're illegal in terms of their citizenship, there's no such thing as a legal human being. But even if, by law, these individuals are seen as in the country illegally, you think about the fact that when they get a paycheck, they're still paying taxes.
Yep.
They're not getting any benefit from it necessarily, but they're paying taxes. So
they're still paying sales tax on basic items as well. Sure.
Absolutely. And that whole taxpayer myth has been used to keep us down. We got to be responsible to the taxpayers. And it's always been, it sounds so good, right? But in reality, it's really quite evil, and it's really quite racist and sexist and classist, and it's fake. It's false. And so one of the things that I failed to mention in the beginning that I think is pertinent right here, right now, is the idea of the currency issuer versus the currency user. And we oftentimes see well-meaning progressives and leftists think that we're going to have state-based Medicare or state-based, job programs, or state-based this, that, and the other. Well, states are like you and I. States are like, a business. They can't create currency out of thin air. They are directly they are directly funded by taxes and bonds and all the things you think the federal government is constrained by. States really are constrained by. Mm-hmm. And most states, I think all but one, have a balanced budget as law in their states. And so, states operate very, very differently than the federal government.
Well, I just have to ask, sorry, but outside funding from the federal level does come into states, doesn't it? I mean, at least for certain programs or things like that. Or
they have some encumbered monies that go to states for various things. But there's a lot more unfunded mandates that the federal government, especially in the United States, impose on states, right?
Okay.
And so if you think about this, why not provide block grants to states per capita based on the number of, people they have and so forth? Provide them block grants and provide them with the ability, instead of, think about this, pensions. In the East states, they're always talking about how the pensions are killing the state programs, and you see them try to raise taxes, and then the businesses pick up and they move to Texas, where the Texans end up once again suffering from giving sweetheart deals to business and really letting the public space go to hell. In the very high end places, it's great, but most of them are not. And you look at Kansas, Brownback. I mean, this guy cut the hell out of everything. And they were using textbooks that were falling apart, and these kids couldn't even go to school. So the race to the bottom at the state level is very real. Mm. And so when you try to do big things at the state level, you're going to have to raise taxes big time, and that's going to cause people to leave your state. The federal government can literally absorb all of that. And so the idea of understanding currency issuer versus currency user is very important. You brought up the euro, and I think it's important to understand that in Europe, many of those countries that joined the European Union, that gave up their sovereign currency, like Greece, which is no longer on the drachma, it's now on the euro, and like Italy, that is no longer on the lira, but it's on the euro, and so forth. These countries have lost their monetary sovereignty. They've lost their ability to, quote unquote, print money to deal with the circumstances that they face.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand, because you look at like the Northern European countries, and they're all net exporters. Germany is a massive net exporter. And since they're not a currency sovereign anymore, you look at them and they say, okay, well, they're making money because they are an exporter. And you look at Greece. Well, Greece is a net importer. I mean, their main crop or whatever is tourism. So how in the world is Greece going to be able to maintain a robust infrastructure and so forth? And you can only tax so much. And in those conditions, if you think about Margaret Thatcher's, there's no such thing as public money. There's only taxpayer money, right? She gave that bullshit line, and she created a whole neoliberal mindset. But it's true in Europe in that sense, right? In Eurozones, it's true. But in the United States, it's not, because the federal government is like the Troika, and the states are like Greece and Germany, if you think about it like that. So it's important to understand the federal government, the currency issuing governments have unlimited power. They have godlike power over their currency. The states, these countries in the euros, they do not. And so that is what is different. That's why the United States will never be Greece. That is why China will never be Greece. That's why Japan will never be Greece. And, I think it's also funny, and you probably will ask me this later, but I'll just jump to the quick here on this. The idea of the national debt, right? This is something we hear a lot about, the national debt, and we hear about deficits and so forth. And, my God, when you think about it, you're going to pass this debt on to your grandchildren. It's immoral, right? It's immoral. But what is the national debt? All the national debt is the sum total of every untaxed dollar or yen or won or ruble that has yet to be received in tax by the nation state. And so the national, because you think about it, if you're looking at double entry accounting, every time you issue an asset, you've got a corresponding liability. And so these double entries, in the government's case, the liability is the tax. We issued this dollar. They're saying we'll accept that $1 for $1 in tax payment. That's what the national debt is.
It's like an IOU.
If that, it's not even, because remember the core MMT principle. A country or a currency issuing entity can never go broke on debt denominated in its own currency, because it just creates it at will. And so, when you look at places like China, who do an immense amount of business in the United States, China gets US dollars for its sales in the United States. Well, what is it going to do with those dollars? It keeps them parked at the Fed. Well, what is it going to do with them parked at the Fed? Not a damn thing. So what do? They go ahead and they buy treasury bonds so they can earn a nominal interest rate on their trillions of dollars of business that they sell into the US. And so that in of itself, whenever we sell a bond, it's already, the interest is already understood. It's already calculated. It's not some new thing. We already know what we're doing. We're selling a debt instrument, and this debt instrument is a 5-year bond, and we're going to pay it at 2%. Well, we budget that money and keystroke it in and there. Well, what happens if China dumps all their dollars? Who gives a shit? We'll delete them, right? It's not a big deal, right? Now, what happens if the US dollar is no longer one of the global world reserve currencies? And there's a basket of them, right? Japan's yen is a part of that. I mean, there's a bunch of them. It's not like just the US dollar.
Now, this
happens to be the most prevalent.
This is the fear that people who actually are hoarding gold, I think gold bugs you call them, this is their number one fear, right?
Right. It's up there, right? So what happens? The United States is decidedly a net importing nation. We have gone from a production-based economy to a service-based economy. And so as a part of that, we have in turn become net importers. Well, if you're trading pieces of paper for their real goods and services, Warren Mosler would tell you that is a net benefit, that exports are a cost. Steve Keen would tell you that's crazy, but Steve Keen is talking political economy. Warren Mosler is talking accounting. Okay. And so if you look at the idea of exports and imports, somehow or another, you've got to offset the money leaving the country, that money for those exports. Otherwise, your bathtub is going to keep shrinking. That bathtub of the economy will keep shrinking the more your money leaves the country.
Yeah.
And so that's what they call a demand leakage. Anyway, bottom line is that what happens if suddenly people don't want the US dollar? First of all, that would mean they would have to stop doing business, selling any goods and services in the United States, which is just preposterous. It's not going to happen.
It's insane.
It's stupid. It's so stupid that you just want to just smack people on the forehead. It's so stupid, right? But let's just say hypothetically their worst fears come true. Everyone loses faith in the dollar, right?
Yeah.
In the United States, the reason why you can never lose faith in dollars, because if you try to pay your taxes in Bitcoin, chicken necks, sexual favors, or frog legs, they're going to say, go away. The only thing you can pay your taxes with is the US dollar. So it's always going to have demand. Why did the Confederacy go bankrupt? Because they couldn't enforce a tax, right? The United States government has a tax and you're going to pay it. And that's the deal. So what happens though, if we can no longer buy imports at a reasonable price or whatever? Well, what's going to happen is it's going to bring manufacturing home. And that's both good in some respects because the supply chain shrinks. And during this pandemic where we were wondering how we would build an iPhone when it's spread across 47 countries. Now, all of a sudden, it's going to be built in the US. Okay, so be it. But now you've got a waste footprint that you're dealing with. Now you're dealing with pollution in your backyard. You're dealing with real resource constraints and you're dealing with other things. So there's a give and there's a take there. Most Americans have gotten to the point where they aren't built for a factory floor like that anymore. The old production that they do in China, those people are used to doing that now. That's where they are in their economic model, but they're trying to break away from that now. And they're trying to become a service-based economy. And you see them lapping us, kicking our rump because they recognize that the good news for them is they got a little bit of a command and control economy and they're pumping money, huge money into building infrastructure. And they're
big
about
proponents of MMT over there in China.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you watch now, all of a sudden, Biden is trying to turn China into the new Russia and just to make them the bad guys. And so that's what the impetus is for his infrastructure bill, that we got to catch up to them. We got to build the new modern this, that, and the other, and all the AI and all the other, advances in technology. We got to do it because China. And so that works with Republicans, I guess. But in reality, why do we have to be in conflict? Why can't we work collaboratively? Why do we have to be at war? Why do we have to be at odds? Why can't we collaborate? It's because of capitalism, and it's because of the false beliefs in money. So ultimately, the big fear of us not being the world reserve currency just means they're going to bring the jobs home. It means they're going to friggin' manufacture shit in the United States. Get over it, Snappy. I mean, just deal with it.
Which is what a lot of people, have at least been claiming publicly they want.
It's funny. And it's almost shameful at this point that people still hold on to those Ayn Randian ideas. I mean, just truth be told, my story. I came from that. I don't know if any of you have ever lifted weights or been in the gym kind of thing. But when I was in the gym, right back in the day, I hurt my shoulders very much and I put too much weight on the bar. And the trainer came over to me and told me, Steve, you've got to earn the weight. You can't just jump to it. Yes, you can lift it, but your joints aren't ready. Those little tiny things aren't ready to handle that weight. You've got to earn the weight. Okay. And when it comes to knowledge, you got to earn the knowledge too. MMT is not a spectator sport. MMT is something that you've got to dig in and learn because you become part of this mesh, this network of people that are trying to fundamentally change the way things are done and to change the way people see the world. And we're not there yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. And there's a lot of reasons to believe we may never get there. And that would lead to natural Marxist ideas of revolution and other things, but which I'm not, opposed to, by the way. But just in reality, right here, right now, if we as, activists that become aware of this stuff, take this calling seriously, you've got to earn the knowledge. You've got to do the reading. There's no substitute for digging in and learning this stuff, because you're now the force multiplier. You're now part of that mix of people that has the responsibility, as unfortunate as it may be. It's like in the Matrix when they go out there and they pull the thing off and like, oh my God, what am I looking at? Oh, that woman in the red dress was great, but that steak, you remember Cypher, that steak, I know it ain't real, but damn it, man, it's a lot better than watching those like metal octopuses flying all over the place,
Sure.
And so, our eyes are now open, and it's both tragic and beautiful at the same time, because you see all the unnecessary death, and it's murder. Austerity is murder. And that's my tagline on Twitter.
Yeah,
austerity really is murder.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
it, man.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, I love that Twitter handle.
Yeah, it's a good one. A lot of what you just said there leads kind of perfectly into what I wanted to ask next. So,
Sure.
we already mentioned that, like at its heart, like MMT it's a macroeconomic theory. It's a tool to be used. It's not inherently political necessarily. But then, I mean, you did go on to say that once you learn about it, it shows you a kind of moral vision of the world, right? Like, if you're not going to do this, then you're an asshole. If you are going to do X, Y, and Z, you're a better person type thing. But I'm just curious about like how it does seem to also be, MMT does seem to be sort of immediately thought of as a movement, like in a way as well. And I just want to dig into that a little bit. Like, do you see like factionalism at all within we'll say the world of MMT? Like, are there right MMT people and center MMT people left? Because I do know, it seems vast majority at least are aligned on the left to some degree. But how do you see all of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of factions, and it's we like to look at it as narrow MMT and broad MMT. Okay, so narrow MMT is typically the Warren Mosler school of thought, which is just brass tacks, bare bones. I mean, it's just the facts, Jack, kind of thing, right? And Warren
he's the hedge fund guy. Am I getting that right?
He is. He was a hedge fund and a bank. Yes. Warren is a very good friend of mine who I happen to love as a father figure in many ways. I care very much for the man. But Warren and my politics are a little different. Warren is more conservative in many ways than I am. And, he sees he's got issues with labor movements, and he's got issues with, some of the concepts of the left. But he is definitely on the left of center. Okay. But there are other folks out there like the Modern Money Network that are literally taking critical theory, and they are creating an entirely new philosophical framework from which to understand the relationship between money, credit, and people and society and power relationships. So there is a broad MMT there. Not everybody subscribes to that. And those are not technical terms. I'm using them, narrow being just the facts, Jack. And then now that we understand that, well, what do we do with it? So they've taken and created a framework by which to understand the moral implications and the power dynamics and the intersectionality. And I got to be honest with you, there's some of the stuff that they come up with that, I like to believe myself to be a reasonably intelligent man. And some of it just is beyond my comprehension. I don't have the great, Hegelian understanding and, some of the Marxist dialectics and things like that they're fighting about. It's beyond me. I mean, I'm trying to learn that stuff, but it is a little beyond me. So I tend to focus more on things that impact all of us, because I try not to say things beyond my understanding. But there is a world that's far more expansive in the MMT universe. And, some would say like there's post-Keynesianism. Some will say that what the modern money network is doing would be considered post-MMT, or, broad MMT, whatever you want to call it. It takes into account, the aesthetics. It takes into account, theater and the impacts of society on power relationships and how credit is distributed and the access to things. And so it's an incredibly incisive way of viewing the world. And I would say, for what I do understand of it, it's an amazing world to step into. It's challenging, but it's great. And so the future is being charted by these young guys who are brilliant minds, people like Ron Gray and, Raul Carrillo, Nathan Tankus, obviously Stephanie Kelton and so forth. But you got gentlemen like Bill Mitchell and others who, are more in the narrow MMT camp. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just, these guys are building on top of what, okay, so if this is true, then kind of statements, right? And they're taking it to the next level. There's moments where I cringe because they try and change language. They try to, like, for example, monetarily sovereign to me just means you have the exclusive right to print currency. Okay. To them, they don't like that word. Why is that? Well, first of all, the sovereigns have not always benefited Black people. The sovereigns have not exactly helped gay and lesbian people. They have not helped the Hispanic communities and the poor. So the idea of the sovereign makes adopting MMT for some groups very challenging. So they're trying to change some of the language that has traditionally been associated with MMT. And so there's a lot of understanding where people are coming from, because ultimately a lot of these social constructs and the legal framework from which MMT derives its credibility, really, it has to be understood through many lenses, many, you could use a dialectic there, from different perspectives, right? Different, this may be true for you, but over here, this Black person has never experienced a single good thing based on this idea of the sovereign. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of, George Lakoff, the great framer of language, would say, hey, you got to make it so it's accessible. And I think these guys, they're up here in the stratosphere. No question. They're not talking to you and me. They're talking to other philosophers and stuff. But that work does trickle down to us guys here who are starting to recognize policy implications of power dynamics and how we can build broad intersectional coalitions to make these things happen. Because remember, money is supposed to be the least important thing. The real resources, and how do we resource this? How do we get the votes for this? How do we build these broad coalitions to make real substantive change that works for all? And I think that that's what a new modern money framework might give you.
Yeah, I've dabbled in some of the more esoteric side of what you were talking about. And yeah, some of it is it's just very much through the language of like you said, critical theory. It's very academic. And yeah, while some people might enjoy like parsing all of those more sort of nuanced, difficult things. I think that it's not to make a big value judgment either, but like, I think it's more important to have people who can take something that is, you talked about that infographic of the straight line and the Gordian knot. Like, in a way, MMT is simple, but in other ways, there are academic textbooks and papers that are very impenetrable to the average person. Yeah. So it's still good to have people that can like really break it down in, I guess, the simplest terms possible. And I think that's an important thing to have. And I guess I was a little curious. We don't have to get too into this, but like you've mentioned Marxism a couple of times, and I've read a few even scathing Marxist critiques of MMT, that from, some of the more like, I guess, hardline sources.
Right.
I guess I won't name names, but you said that, you feel sort of a kinship with Marxism, or you're not even opposed to it philosophically necessarily, but I don't know. Is there anything you want to even add about like criticisms from the left on MMT? I guess is my bigger question.
Well, the podcast I released today was by Professor Steve Keen. He and I talked about what Marx got wrong. And Steve Keen has probably read more Marx than most Marxists ever even dreamed possible. I mean, I've got Capital sitting on my bed and it's about the size of my arm, and the print requires a magnifying reader just to get through it. Okay. So the average person's never gotten through volume 1 of Marx, much less volumes 2 and 3. Okay. Yeah. And a lot of these folks, they just have it in their brain that somehow or another Marx meant that we shouldn't have any cash in society, that we shouldn't have money. But that's like saying we shouldn't have pounds or inches, because all money is really a score. It's a tally for provisioning. How would you give balance to purchases? How would you give balance to real resources other than having some sort of an accounting system of sorts? So their critique of it usually falls flat on its face. It's usually a feels-based approach. But the thing is that socialism is a spectrum, right? And if you've done any research on, Lenin and the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks and so forth, you realize that so much of what was going on, they had never experienced real political life before. Russians were in a czarist, world, and it was a lot of peasantry. It was a lot of people that didn't understand. And so, some of the stuff, 10 Days That Shook the World, and some of the other stories about, Rasputin and, all this, they're almost comedy stories. When Nicholas was killed and his family was killed, it was really kind of, tragic in one sense, but almost hilarious how bumbling these people were.
Yeah.
And so you realize that ultimately, Marx, one of the beautiful things about this is that socialism is in many ways about dialectics, and it's about contradictions. And it's about understanding the world around you and the conditions by which, if you're dealing with idealism with Hegel and you're dealing with materialism with, Marx and others, you're really trying to understand the current scenario. And we no longer are an industrialized world, and we are not here in the United States anyway. And so a lot of the concepts that you see when you read a lot of like What Is to Be Done by Lenin and all the different writings and pamphlets that he put out, and you read, the Communist Manifesto and so forth, you realize ultimately that each of these things is kind of a framework as well, but it's not God breathed. These things change. And so you have to understand what the material conditions of the times are. And, some MMTers would say that material conditions are not enough to evaluate the times, that there's more to that story in terms of idealism and so forth. And so this, once I go beyond what I'm saying now, I start entering into that gray zone of I'm talking past my point of understanding. But if we just keep it where I've kept it, I can pretty much roundly say that socialism is a spectrum, and MMT can work in any of those frameworks. And the criticisms from Marxists are typically on labor theory of value and understanding, how value is created and surplus value is created. And the podcast, like I said, with Steve Keen today, we literally debunked Marx's labor theory of value. And there's many Marxists that have, especially scholars in the Marxist space, who have rejected labor theory of value as well, as more is known about the, he doubled down. He got some things wrong, and he's like, well, it doesn't really fit with my theory. So, I'm going to go ahead and double down and just keep going forward anyway, even though I kind of disproved it here. And so, Marx was a great, brilliant mind, but he wasn't God. And, he was failed. He was a human being, and between him and Engels, they were two guys that were trying to figure out the world. And he was a very curious man. He dug into a lot of interesting things like the laws of thermodynamics and other things. He was not a static guy. And so, when we look at today, we don't have a union floor. We don't have the same setup. We have an internet where we're no longer able to really walk out in a strike in the way that we used to be able to do. So you look at, how does Marxist theory of labor and all the rest of, our view of capital apply to today? And, the financialization of our world and of our economy directly show that there is money being made that is not productive in any way, shape, or form. It's purely, vulture. It's purely speculative. It's a casino. And, I think that, we can look at Marx and say, hey, that's bad. But I think we don't need Marx to see that that's bad. We can see that that's bad just based on watching rent-seeking behaviors and so forth. So, I think that a lot of Marxists, when I take the test, I show up clearly as a classic Marxist, but I'm not, I think that they just don't understand. And there is a religious fervor that many Marxists have, much like Bernie's supporters, right?
Right.
Where they just reject things out of hand because they don't understand it.
Because it doesn't fit the narrative.
That's it.
And
so, they're human.
Right. I was just curious about like things being sort of certain political views being compatible or incompatible with MMT.
They're very compatible. Very compatible.
But then, on the flip side, is capitalism compatible with MMT in the long run?
I think capitalism isn't compatible with life on Earth.
We're gonna agree there.
But I will tell you this though, that just like if you get a hole in your blow up pool, you can put a patch on it, right? Now you get another hole and you put another patch on it, but after a while, you put too many patches on it, it just falls apart.
Yeah,
and I think we've seen unfettered, unbridled capitalism in the fire sector in particular really run amok, and it's kind of run its course. And, the private debt that we are experiencing in the US and around the world, it surpasses, it's like, where's this debt going to? Some word that I don't even know. It goes beyond
imaginary numbers.
It's some weird thing, right? And ultimately, even if you're, a Judeo-fascist type person, and you're one of these, folks that, all you got to do is look at your Bible and go back and realize that even then they had debt jubilees, right? The day of Jubilee. So we're primed for a debt jubilee, which by extension, if we don't end whatever that means, end capitalism, there's always a spectrum, right, of private and public ownership. Mm-hmm. And so the means of production and so forth. Who owns the machines, right? When machines start creating things, who owns that? Is that just a public good, or is that the owner of the person that created the machine or whatever? And so I think that we'll probably never in our lifetime see a true complete and utter abandonment of capitalism and just a full embrace of public ownership of everything, right? I don't think that will happen in our lifetimes. And Trotsky, believed that we couldn't have socialism here if we didn't have socialism throughout the entire world. So Trotsky believed in a nonstop revolutionary experience. Others like Lenin believed that you could, in fact, do them local. And guys like Stalin said, hey, move over. I'm going to go ahead and do a top-down command and control type socialism. So there's a lot of different views here, right? And I don't know. I part of me thinks that leftists as a whole like to fight. And whereas the right in general is constantly just like, hey, we just don't want socialism. That's an easy message, right? They don't have to do anything. They just keep going as is. Keep the darkies down, keep the gays over here, do that. We're fine, right?
Yeah.
But the left, we want change. And so that means that we have to fight over what the change really is.
It's a lot of tactical stuff, it's just
absolutely.
And as annoying as it is, I feel like it's in some ways sort of inescapable and just a growing pain that has to be like gone through.
Yes.
But yeah, sometimes it's probably meritless too. Like when you see certain factions, when they're like, we talked about factionalism with an MMT, and then we were talking about Marxism. I was just kind of chuckling to myself, thinking like, if you want factionalism, just look at like any universities like Marxist experts, like it's going to be, each one's going to be different than the last.
You got it, man. And one of the things that I think is really important, and I don't think enough of us do this, is without having some historical understanding of the world around you, without having some theory backing your view of history even, you end up just sort of aimless, right? Everything can sound kind of good or bad. And it's like orphan politics. They don't really have any connections, and there's no input output tool technique. It's kind of like just a bunch of islands all over the place. And I think that while it's inevitable, I think that a lot of the stuff that we experience is because history is taught by the victors. And we have spent a century trying to deny any good from socialism, trying to block out any kind of possible praise that could come from socialism. We've painted it as just a bunch of murderous, thugs, and they really, really make you terrified of, oh my God, Leninist, and you see the pointy chin and the, and you got all the, the buzzwords that, I mean, the greatest generation was pumped full of hatred for socialism and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And, think about how many people have been killed in the name of, hey, you can't be communist. Look at Martin Luther King. I mean, so many people.
It's interesting too, considering the role socialism played in forcing FDR's hand to fix the country, save the country, arguably.
Yeah, you know what?
The thanks we get.
I'm gonna beg to differ with you on this one, because he wasn't exactly what you would call a socialist, right? He was.
Well, I'm saying forcing his hand, like applying pressure from the outside.
Well, yeah, but he didn't bring socialism in there. He threw a couple breadcrumbs at us.
Oh, they were sure. Good breadcrumbs. I agree with that. Yeah, but
they were really. I mean, if you talk to black people at that time, they don't think the New Deal was very special.
Well, yeah, definitely.
There's a lot of people out there that, the Japanese weren't too terribly fond of FDR. There's a lot of folks that really didn't do very well from this, right? There's a lot of people that did. And so if you think about it, that really is kind of that social democracy. That's kind of the Dem Soc. You could, what's his name? Kerensky, right? If you've done any theory reading and stuff, that he's kind of like Kerensky, right? He's not really giving you any kind of meaningful balance of labor and not giving you the means of production. He's giving you some nice feel good things. He's, right. And he saved us from the collapse of the stock market and so forth. He understood deficit spending, right? And I want to say something. One funny thing about FDR and World War II and all the other good stuff. The whole idea of war bonds, right? Think about this. The factories were churning at 120%. Every man, woman, and child was either at war, the men, or in the factory, the children and the women. And the idea of them having spare cash to spend on random things when the entire industrial complex had been geared toward working the war machine, there wasn't goods and services in that spec. Everything was put toward war. So they sold war bonds to delay purchasing power. I'll put my money to the war to fund the war. The war was being funded with or without their money, right? Without their bonds.
Right.
The issue was always, hey, we need to stave off inflation because we have full employment, super full employment, and we don't have enough real resources because it's all going to the war machine. So that's a little funny story because people oftentimes think of war bonds funding the war effort, when in reality, the war effort was being self-funded with or without the gold standard. And they removed the gold standard during FDR's time too for a while to achieve.
It was like a temporary suspension, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then we went to the Bretton Woods system and so forth. But, ultimately, it's just, I think it's really kind of hilarious because they understood at that time, a lot of people did, what was going on. We've forgotten it. And, MMT, for all its, shininess in today, guys like Marina Eccles, who were, in charge of the Fed, back in the day, in 1946, he was addressing, the Federal Reserve in their quarterly, and he said, hey, taxes for revenue is obsolete. We're no longer tied to the market. We can do what we want, right? The issue for taxation is whether or not taxes are going to give us a strong dollar, a weak dollar, being able to, provide the buying stability that we want. Taxes are not for revenue, though. Yeah. And that's 1946. How did we forget?
There's obviously some forces at play that want us to forget.
Amen.
For I guess
Absolutely.
A number of reasons, a lot of which we've talked about now today.
Absolutely.
I guess maybe this might be my last question. I think we probably got to wrap up in a little bit here, but I've heard some criticism. I forget exactly where it was coming from, but it doesn't really matter. That one of the issues with MMT is that it's like maybe inherently or somehow it's a nationalistic movement or a proposition. Like in other words, we couldn't make this use this globally to raise everyone's standards of living, because like you've made the point that what really matters are actual resources that we have in say a nation state, and including like the resources of labor and natural resources. And obviously some countries have more and less of those things, but is it I'm sure you're going to say no, but is it a possibility that, say, the global South gets left behind in the best utopian version of an MMT world?
In an MMT world led by people that understand MMT, and there's a tremendous amount of effort being done to address the global South. People like Fadl Kaboub, Raul Carrillo, Ndongo Sambasila these are folks that are out there literally fighting to bring about that whole awareness of the global South. Mm-hmm. And I really do believe that ultimately, MMT can do a lot of things. It can do a tremendous amount of things, but it really does come down to understanding that the currency issuer and the currency user are two separate items, and real resources are really what matters. And, you look down there at Venezuela and others, and they've got a single export, product that they live and die on, which is crude. And that's not a very, that's not a very sustainable business model to survive under.
Yeah.
And so they're highly dependent on imports and working collaboratively with other countries. And, obviously places like the United States, who are very extractive and predatory in our imperialism, use that to great precision to keep them down as a, basically to suck the resources out of there. But that's not an MMT thing, right? That's a parasitical, capitalist, neoliberal, imperial minded thing.
I could be a little off base because MMT even this is going back to when we were talking about the small business owners. But I just thought about this with MMT of say America adopted a full MMT policy where they had the guaranteed works program. Everyone had a living wage. Everyone had some cash to do stuff. For countries that were mainly Greece or whatever, that were mainly economies where they want people coming in for tourism and stuff. There'd be more people that had money to do that type of stuff. So it would end up helping these countries maybe.
I was thinking even more directly than that, just in terms of I guess you would call it charitable giving around the world. If there is, if money is more or less infinite, or attached to real resources. But I should let you continue. You probably address that anyway.
Well, I mean, Fadl Kaboub is pushing for a global Green New Deal. And, a job guarantee is a part of a global Green New Deal and global reparations for damage done by capital and damage done by climate and so forth. And you think about, these, what we would typically call third world nations that are lacking food sovereignty, lacking, resource sovereignty, right? And becoming sovereign of your currency is one small thing, but really having the ability to use it to do these things requires a lot of work, because you got to develop the systems to provide irrigation. So you have crops, you have food sovereignty and food security and energy security and all these different things. So really, at the end of the day, a lot of this is about developing these nations. And I think that there is a way, without it being a capital, grab, just resource snatching, to do that in a cooperative, environment, because it's in all of our best interest, even if we don't realize it directly in a capitalist lens. It's in all of our best interest that we help these countries do things in a clean energy way, so that they don't continue to increase their carbon footprint, so that we can stave off climate change. And
right beside China, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah. Let me just say one more thing that I think is important. If you have a federal job guarantee and you have a bunch of immigrants coming to your nation because of climate change, and they are coming into the south border of the United States, and the United States, in its typical jingoistic, xenophobic minded way, is like, hey, you guys get out of here. You're taking our jobs. Well, if you have a federal job guarantee, that's not true anymore, is it?
Right.
Now what you're doing is you're eliminating one of the largest causes of xenophobia in the world today. Yeah. And the ability to provide people with, you think about how many folks that come to countries like this send money back home, and try to help out family back in the old country. They go through hell and back to try and just survive.
And it divides their families up completely as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there's opportunities there that many people will never understand or even take the time to understand. And it really is up to us to do that. But I think, to your point, though, that, Fadl Kaboub in particular, and you can check out our Macro and Cheese interviews with Fadl Kaboub and Ndongo Sambasila. They talk a lot about the global South. There's an incredible push for helping get a global Green New Deal, which would in fact do many of the things that we're talking about right here, right now, to help facilitate, bringing those more impoverished countries not only into a self-sustaining place, but to provide them with the real resources to help get them on their feet. An MMT lens would provide an understanding of how exactly a currency issuing nation, as opposed to just throwing cash for weapons, provide them with, a means of green energy and, irrigation systems. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make sure that the global South, in fact, does not get left behind. But it won't happen accidentally. I mean, the powers that be would very much like to keep extracting. So it really is up to activists such as ourselves to get that word out.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, I got a lot of more questions I'd like to ask you, but hey, that means we can have you back on another time, right?
Anytime, man. I love talking to you guys. This was great.
Oh, it was great. It was really great. So I think that's a good enough note to go out on, if any. But do you want to get some plugs in here?
Well, one of the most important things we do aside from MMT is talk about the elite control fraud in the banking system. And we work with a gentleman who many people know, which is Bill Black. He's a hero of whistleblowers. He worked as one of the top guys going after the Keating Five in the 80s with the savings and loan crisis. And he's been at the forefront of pushing to bring about the, prosecutions of many, many bad actors like Robert Rubin and others who were part and parcel with the collapse in 2008 and 9. So we have another podcast called The New Untouchables, the Pecora Files, where we discuss all of the elite control fraud and the liar's loans and the identity theft and so forth. And we just recorded our first 5 episodes of our season 2 of The New Untouchables last weekend. So I'd expect to start seeing the next round. And it's all about the victims. The first season was all the technocrats and all the, people at the Department of Justice and these different local detectives in Ohio that pursued, everything from Countrywide and Mozilla and City and you name it. Richard Bowen, Art Wilmarth, Richard Bowen, you name it. I mean, we have a tremendous group of people that are supporting us there. Lots of great whistleblowers, people that have put their entire lives and careers on the line to get that truth out there. So I hope folks will catch The New Untouchables. Obviously, the Macro and Cheese podcast that I do we just released our 121st episode today. Every one of our episodes, except for a couple of them where I allowed us to go truly political, they're all evergreen. You can listen to the first one all the way up to present, and it's still timely and still valuable. There's transcripts, you name it, lots of extras. So please dig into our website at realprogressives.org. And, honestly, we've got some great shows at our place with Jody Newell with the Up and Up. We've got a new guy coming on named Luke Parcher. I'll be introducing him tomorrow at noon. Well, tomorrow, I don't know when this will be released, but let's just say 5:23 at noon Eastern time. He'll be making his debut at Real Progress in Action. And, I think we've got a really great organization, and I hope that folks find value in joining us, working with us, volunteering. And, we're a nonprofit, so you can donate to us too, and you get a tax deduction. So it's good stuff.
All right. Absolutely. Yeah. I just listened to a couple, you have several episodes with Bill Mitchell on Macro and Cheese.
I just interviewed him last night, as a matter of fact, on the UBI. So.
And I found I just went back to the earliest ones, and I listened to 3 of them from the earliest, and there's more to hear, but he's a really fascinating, interesting guy to listen to. So I'll personally vouch for the podcast in that way.
Thank you.
And also for the website, I've read a number of the essays on there, and it's great stuff. So yeah,
thank you.
Listeners,
you very much.
Do what we say. Do what Steve says.
Please.
Jason, where are we on the internet?
We're at heatdeathpod.com, and we're also at heatdeath at Twitter.
Heatdeathpod.
Oh, heatdeathpod at Twitter. I always mess it up. And we're at heatdeath of the universe on Instagram, but we don't really use the Instagram account. But you can still visit it. And
yeah,
As always, you can send us messages. You can, email us. You can write to us on Reddit or Twitter or what else do we use? Oh yeah, the website. The website has comments if you want to do that. Carrier pigeons work.
We do love your carrier pigeons. We've got a whole kitchen full here.
Hey, I was remiss in missing one thing. If you'll let me throw this out there,
Yeah,
we have another show that's been going on for a long time called MMT Mondays, and it was originally just a lot of rehashing of Kelton and Mitchell and Mosler and Ray and others. But now we have a gentleman named Caleb Mood who works with a great videographer named Curtis. And the two of them have really taken it to the next level. So definitely pay attention to MMT Mondays as well. There's a lot of really good history baked in there. And the videos are well produced. And I think you'll find them interesting.
And can I just make one more plug? It's mainly
Sure.
because you brought up whistleblowers, and a friend of mine, Daniel Hale, was he's facing up to 50 years in prison for whistleblowing, and just want to mention that we've done a couple of episodes about him now, but just want to mention that there is still like charity stuff going on for him if anyone wants to donate, because he was the guy who released the drone papers to the Intercept for the Obama drone papers. So
Yeah.
I just want to, whenever I hear whistleblowers, I feel like bringing up Daniel right now.
Well, he doesn't get enough attention at all, especially from the Intercept, who I don't understand why they don't talk about him anymore, even though he gave them their big scoop. But yeah, don't forget about Daniel Hale. I'm going to put a ton of this stuff in the show notes, so links will be abundant. And with that, I guess till next time. See you guys.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
it was
for coming on. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was
Stay in
excellent.
touch, guys. I really liked you. This was wonderful.
Great. We're glad to hear that, man. It was great for us too. So yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
The first voice recording was made in 1860. It was a 10-second fragment of the French folk song Au clair de la lune recorded by inventor Edward Leon Scott de Martinville. But who will make the final voice recording and when? What will it be? Who will hear it?